Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
At the Home Depot, the holidays have arrived.
And so is all my family. So I'm working on keeping up with the laundry.
The Home Depot is here to help with Black Friday savings up to 40% off select appliances. Spend less time doing laundry with smart, efficient appliances from Samsung, ranked #1 in customer satisfaction.
Perfect. Less laundry time means more family time.
Get Black Friday savings now with free delivery and financing on select appliances at the Home Depot. Visit jdpower.com/awards for more details. Offer valid November 6th through December 4th. U.S. only. See store or online for details.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am very pleased today to welcome back to the show for the first time in a long time, Danie Burton. Danie, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've had you on the show, and you wrote a book on Anthony Woodville, and I thought, this is such a great topic. Who doesn't love to hear about the Woodvilles? And I had to have you back on to discuss him. So before we get into questions and learning more about him, my first question is always, what made you choose Anthony Woodville for a topic of a book?
Well, it all started about 9 years ago, which is kind of where the research journey started. I knew of him through his connections with how Richard III became Richard III. That's kind of what I knew of him before. So we visited Pontefract Castle as a family just around about the time I was starting uni, and that's where Anthony was executed. So, I just went there, it's got obviously quite a historical place, quite a few connections with the Wars of the Roses. Went there. Didn't, see anything to do with that part of its history. They're very much more focused on that's where Richard II died, which is obviously another fairly important thing that happened.
Yes.
But yeah, so I kind of was like, well, why isn't there anything? Because it's quite an important castle, particularly in Wars of the Roses, but obviously in terms of Anthony's story. So I remember asking the staff that worked there, do you know anything about what he was like when he was here, his execution, anything, just anything would be good. And they just looked at me quite blankly and went, we don't really know who you're talking about, which I was like, oh, okay. And that's kind of what started this research journey, really, because I was like, well, why don't they know who Anthony is? So it was through that I kind of realised that actually, even though you kind of know the Woodville name, that Anthony's kind of been a bit forgotten, and it was trying to bring him out the shadows, really.
Yeah. And honestly, the only thing I ever knew about him before your book was the movie The White Queen, which was based on Philippa Gregory's book. Have you read the book or seen the series?
Yes, definitely. Yes. So I was, obviously being a big Wars of the Roses fan in general, I was very excited when they did The White Queen. And I think that was one of the other things that kind of set the ball rolling of, again, that even in that is kind of a background figure, but obviously important, obviously, particularly to Elizabeth Woodville's story, obviously, is her brother. And I was like, surely this man can't be this grumpy. And actually, I found somebody very different to that portrayal. Yes, okay, he did have a very serious side to him, but I don't think, just like we're all complicated, I don't think that was the whole of him.
Right. There was more to him than was portrayed on film or in the book. Most definitely. Well, let's start at the beginning, really, when it comes to Anthony Woodville, and let's talk about his family, his lineage, where he came from, so that people could fully understand. We know about Elizabeth Woodville, but let's talk about Anthony's lineage today.
Okay, so the place to start really is obviously with both Elizabeth and Anthony's parents, Jaquetta and Richard Woodville. So everybody's got this idea of the fact that because of what happens when Elizabeth marries Edward IV, it's all, very much, okay, this is a fairly scheming family. They want to promote themselves. And okay, I'm not saying that's entirely inaccurate, because there are definitely some examples of that within the Woodville family. But in terms of Richard and Jacquetta, that's not how it starts. Really, their marriage is a love match entirely, basically. So Jacquetta was first of all married to John, Duke of Bedford, who was the uncle of Henry VI and Regent of France. And he didn't last long into their marriage, basically. And we know that this kind of around about the time that we're not sure about the entire circumstances, but when Richard and Jacquetta kind of know each other, as Richard is actually a knight within Bedford's household, so they'd have at least known each other before that. But obviously, as to when a love match started, is a been lost to the ether, as it were. But they'd have known each other, and they paid the price for that match themselves, because obviously Richard is only a very lowly knight, and Jacquetta comes from a very well-to-do noble family who can trace their lineage to French royalty. So we can see immediately that actually their relationship is very similar to what their daughter then goes on to have in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so when we're looking at Anthony's life, I think one of the things that intrigued me about your book was his involvement with Edward IV and when exactly that came into the picture. Because, of course, I'm going to use the White Queen as a reference again, because that's what I know the best. And the White Queen, of course, he didn't really have any interaction with Edward IV until Edward showed up at the castle. Then he was like, oh, this guy, but that really wasn't the case, was it?
No. So when the Wars of the Roses first start out, because of obviously that connection that the Woodvilles have had with Bedford and obviously the Lancastrian side, that is where they start off with the Wars of the Roses. They are firmly in the Lancastrian camp, definitely, until you end up getting to the big massive Battle of Towton, which is basically the battle that cemented Edward IV as Edward IV. It's that has helped his claim to the throne, basically. And it's this massive Yorkist victory. So both Richard and Anthony are there fighting at Towton for the Lancastrians. Anthony himself is misreported as having been killed in the battle, which is understandable considering it is probably one of the biggest battles that's ever happened on British soil. So I can understand easily why that kind of thing would happen. But the Woodvilles are canny in a way. They kind of seen this massive Lancastrian defeat and they go, look, Edward's quite clearly proved himself right now. I think perhaps we ought to go and grovel a little bit, and that's exactly what they do. They ask for pardons, and then within months they get it, and that's kind of sort of where their story kind of starts, really. But it doesn't obviously develop into the familial relationship for quite a few years after that.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you find out that that's the truth behind the story, because I feel like, historical fiction sometimes tells us the wrong narrative, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I'm all for a good, historical fiction, but it's always a case of remembering that it's somebody's viewpoint mixed in with a bit of fact.
Right. It's a story. It's being written to entertain. It's not necessarily being written as factual. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Let's move forward a little bit to, I guess I don't know. Did he have his first marriage prior to Elizabeth marrying Edward IV? Let's talk about that.
Yes. Yeah, so the other thing that's usually kind of thrown at the Woodvilles is very much how much that after Edward and Elizabeth marry, how much of the marriage market that they take up, because there's a lot of Woodville siblings.
Yes.
But actually, Anthony is one of the only ones that doesn't actually apply to. So he did actually marry his first wife, Elizabeth Scales, prior to Elizabeth and Edward getting married. We don't really have an exact date for their marriage, but it could be anywhere from around about Towton to any point within the next couple of years before Elizabeth marries Edward. So like I said, you're talking quite a few years at least before the royal marriage per se. And the whole reason of that marriage is the fact that the Woodvilles and the Scales, they have a kind of friendship going on. So Richard Woodville is a brother-in-arms, comrade, friend with Elizabeth Scales' father, Thomas Lord Scales. So again, that's probably another reason for that match, that obviously Elizabeth Scales is her father's heiress. Obviously, that's a bit of playing in there as well. But it's also creating that closer ties of kinship between the two families as well.
Yeah. So what kind of marriage did Anthony have with her?
So this is actually quite a hard question because we don't really know that much in terms of specifics about their marriage per se. But the bits that we do get is mostly from kind of legal documents, that sort of thing. So we do know that obviously Anthony inherits the title of Lord Scales through his wife. So that's why you see him either listed as Lord Scales or as or both at the same time. So in that respect, you kind of think, oh yeah, okay, definitely he's married her for the money, the title, etc., etc. But actually, one of the things that most surprised me during this research was so Anthony was also Lord of the Isle of Wight, so he looked after the Isle of Wight. And there was one document that turned up in the Isle of Wight archives, and it said Anthony and his consort Elizabeth, meaning his wife Elizabeth.
Interesting.
So I think, wow, that. I think, like I said, we really don't know that much about their marriage other than we can glean the fact that they seem to quite like enjoying each other's company. They've had, so in their lands in Norfolk, we have King's Lynn off giving them fish, both of them, in both of their names, not just Anthony's. So I think actually the fact that this legal document, which is kind of given the Isle of Wight tax relief, that sort of idea, specifically mentions Anthony and his consort, I think that's quite unusual wording, and I think in a way will show what kind of relationship that they must have had. But they'd have also spent a lot of time apart as well, because Anthony was away doing a lot of things. But we also know that they took Margaret of York, Edward's youngest sister, to her marriage to Charles, the future Duke of Burgundy. They both went out as part of her marriage party, so they kind of headed up that party. So, and like I said, you kind of get glimpses of probably what their relationship was like.
Yeah, I wish we had portraits of them. Like, when we look at the Tudor period, it seems like there's portraits of everyone. But during the reign of Edward IV and before that, there's really not these visual images to make us more attached to these figures.
Yes, yeah, because I think obviously that's not something that's come about just yet. But yes, sadly we only have one image of Anthony Woodville, and that's from an illuminated manuscript that he actually helped produce with Caxton. So that's, again, like you said, it's a very stock image. So you kind of get a flavour of who he is, but not quite enough for what you want either. So yeah.
Now, in that marriage, did the couple have any children together?
No. So Anthony only ever had one illegitimate daughter that we think that he had before his marriage to Elizabeth, because she was actually named Margaret. So we think that she was probably named after Margaret of Anjou whilst the family was still Lancastrian. And we don't really know much about her either, other than her mother was probably a Welsh woman. So we don't know how that relationship came about either. And all we do know is that actually Anthony really provided for her, and she married a man called Robert Poignants, which actually for an illegitimate daughter was a good marriage. So he did make sure that she was looked after in that respect. And that's really all we know about Margaret as well.
Wow, that's too bad. Well, the marriage, if I recall from your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't super long, was it?
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary. and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
So Elizabeth Scales, she died in 1473. So this is when he's actually away in Spain when Elizabeth Scales dies. So he's actually on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which is where, a big pilgrimage site in Northern Europe. And he's actually just undertaken that in honour of his mother, Chiquetta, who died a year later. So we don't have a clue whether or not he'd have known, any news would have been able to reach him whilst he was on this pilgrimage, or whether he had to actually come home to that news. But either way, that's quite a double blow in that respect, that, within a few years that he's lost two of the closest women in his to him.
Yeah, that would be incredibly difficult. I'm also curious. So within that time, then his sister would have married Edward IV, and his sister would be queen consort. Do we have any idea of what kind of relationship Anthony had with Edward IV? Did they get along? Do we know?
Yeah, so Anthony's relationship with Edward IV, they were quite close, really. So they are, Anthony is part of that inner circle of Edward IV. People say very much how the Woodvilles completely and utterly benefited. And actually, I'm not saying that they didn't, that would be completely the wrong thing to say. But actually, Anthony didn't gain a lot of the titles and privileges until after 1473. So that's after Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, is born. So it's kind of a bit more, he's been rewarded for looking after and helping his nephew to grow up. So in that respect, he doesn't benefit straight away in terms of a lot of the, the titles and privileges he's getting. But again, like I said, he's part of this inner circle, and he can't avoid being now the king's brother-in-law. But they are very different people, really. So I think because Anthony was very much, a jouster, he was very much into his books. He was definitely a very religious person, and as far as we can tell, he was also quite reserved, and like I said, the exact opposite of what Edward the Fourth is. Sorry. So yes, so it's like I said, there's not really too much source-wise about what their relationship is, but I think they got on, but they were very, very different people. But Anthony was part of that inner circle who went into exile with Edward, and obviously returned with him as well. So like I said, they are there together, and Anthony's very much chosen often as the English jousting champion. So they must have got some sort of good relationship going on, definitely. But like I said, completely different personality-wise.
Well, it's interesting to me because when I think of Edward IV, I think one of the things I remember learning about him was he had a rather large library. So I feel like that's something that he and Anthony had in common, was books. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely. They did. Edward did have a large library, and that actually only really comes into existence as his own library after they come back from their exile in Burgundy. And that's probably because they're whilst in exile in Burgundy. So at this point, Charles the Bald cannot really openly acknowledge them as exiles, because it's a little bit politically, not the right thing to be doing. But again, he is now Edward, by that point, he's Edward IV's brother-in-law as well himself. So he needs to do it a bit more under the radar. So what happens is he gets one of his, because obviously Burgundy is lots of different states made up into Burgundy. So he actually gets one of his representatives, Louis, the Lord of Grethus, to be the person to look after them whilst they're in exile. And Grethus is actually the person that's known to have got the largest library in Europe. So I think that's partly what's influencing Edward in terms of we know that that's one of the reasons why he's building up his library, because he's obviously been immersed in that, and because there does actually gift books to him. So I think it's very much, as with Edward, with a lot of things to do with Edward, is he really doing it because he likes it, or is he doing it because he thinks it's a little bit of the latest trend?
Yeah, it's like if you own a lot of books now just because you want it to make you look smart versus actually reading the books.
Yes, I'm not saying that he didn't do, but I think that's knowing Edward's personality, he was busy doing other things.
Yeah.
Really. Whereas I think Anthony was very much, he really was immersing himself, and he really was completely and utterly interested in literature. And like I said, he had the connection, being the first and best English patron of William Caxton, and he's helping to produce all of these new texts in English for the first time. So I think he's gone above and beyond. Whereas I kind of really do feel a little bit like Edward's like, yeah, that's my collection over there.
Take a look at it. It's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, and it's been a while since you've been on the show to talk about William Caxton, but let's talk about who William Caxton was and the bigger involvement maybe that Anthony had with him, big picture.
Okay. So William Caxton was the first person to bring the printing press to England. And so, first of all, he starts off in actually, funnily enough, in Burgundy. And that's where we kind of think where the connection with Anthony came, either through the marriage of Margaret of York or whilst they're in exile. And he doesn't actually start out as a printer at all. He's actually, first of all, he's a merchant, and that's kind of what he's doing. And he's actually ends up working his way up within the English merchant community in Bruges. And he actually works his way up to being the representative of the whole English merchant community. So that kind of gives you a sense of where his background is a little bit. So we do know that obviously that means that he's probably taking part in a lot of the celebrations when Margaret comes to Burgundy. So that's one of the options of, where that connection might have come from. Well, like I said, when Edward and his court are in exile, because by that point, Caxton is starting to try out printing, and actually Margaret of York was his first proper patron whilst he's setting up in Burgundy there. So that's kind of where that starts, and we think one or other of those options is how Anthony kind of sort of started to know William Caxton. And then Caxton set up his first printing shop and printing press in London in around about 1476. So, and actually Anthony was his patron right from the very beginning, and within a year they produced the Dicks and Sayings of Philosophers, and that is actually the first book to be published in England, the definite date and place of publication.
Well, that's really cool. That's a great story. And I always think of that painting. There is that famous painting, right, of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. I think you see their library in the background, and maybe there's a printing press in the room. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yes, that's actually that's kind of a bit more of a later version of what happened. But yes, that's kind of usually the sort of image that people remember.
Yeah. And of course, then it makes it seem like it was Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville who brought that all about, doesn't it?
Yes. Which obviously, you've got to kind of acknowledge the king, and that's basically what happens, certainly with the Dicks and Sayings Philosophers, is they do make, obviously, but even as this new technology is forming, there is a crossover still with illuminated manuscripts. So that known image that we have of Anthony from the illuminated manuscript is actually him presenting the copy of the Dicks and Sayings of the Philosophers to Edward IV in the manuscript version. So yes, so I think that shows you a bit more as to where that's come from.
Yeah, the truth comes out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk too about he wasn't just married once. He had a second marriage. And let's talk about that and how that marriage came about and how long it was between his first marriage and his second marriage as well, and what that might say.
Yeah, so you're talking about around about 8, 9 years between both marriages. So Anthony's second wife, Mary Fitzlewis, she was actually only a teenager, so there was quite a large age gap between them both. And again, we don't actually really quite understand Anthony's thinking behind this particular marriage because while she's not obviously, she's connected to quite a lot of the rich families at this time, she's not in direct inheritance of anything. You know, if there is, it's kind of things way off, and you could like argue forever over who might or might not get anything. So that doesn't seem to be a motivation. And then again, you think, well, if she is a teenager and very young teenager at that, is he thinking about, okay, I've not had any children with my first wife? Is that a possibility? But even so, she would not have been at the age to be having children just yet. She's that young, you know, it's just before the age that they kind of sort of agree that maybe trying for children is a good idea. So, like I said, there's not really any clear cut reason as to why they got married necessarily. And we believe that they spent even less time than what Anthony and his first wife, Elizabeth Scales, would have spent together. So it's all a bit hazy in terms of his second wife. But we do know that's quite a long time as well for somebody to not remarry, particularly in this period. So we do know that actually Edward IV did kind of try and push Anthony as a good, Bachelor of England kind of idea. So we do know that he's trying to marry him off to people in Burgundy, Princess of Scotland, because he's trying to use Anthony as a replacement for Clarence whilst they're arguing and whatever. So again, it's proven a little bit that probably what Edward is thinking about Anthony, but is he using him as a bit of a political bargaining tool? A little bit, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting that he did that. One of the things that we know about Anthony Woodville is that he was very pious, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us some more about that? Because I think that plays a lot into his character.
Yeah, so as I've alluded to, we know that he went on pilgrimage quite a lot in his life, certainly within the British circle in England. Like I said, he went to Santiago de Compostela, and that was also where he actually picked up the French text that became the Dixon Saying of Philosophers. So there's quite a few things going off. Again, for him, creating texts, certainly with the Dixon Saying of Philosophers, because that's actually moral and religious sayings by ancient philosophers. That's another way for him to get across his religious and moral ideas. So it's quite complicated, actually. His, how he portrays his faith. He's not only is he obviously going on these massive pilgrimages, and not just within this country, also abroad, because he also went to Rome later on as well. That takes a lot of organising. That takes a lot of, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to, share my faith to other people, or even to himself, obviously, as well. So that really does play a part in how he's thinking, how he's feeling. And we do know that he was very much bothered about giving to religious institutions as well. So I know that people kind of, in this day and age where we don't really think of religion in society so much, obviously compared to what they did in Anthony's day, I think you could probably be a bit cynical and say, oh, well, is he just doing that because he's following the crowd, or, he's showing off, going, oh, yeah, I believe this, but does he really? And I was like, but I don't think that's something that you can put on how people think in the past, really. But I think Anthony himself really did mean it, because he actually even adopted the pilgrim shell as his personal emblem and things like that. So he really is probably, going out of his way to show how personally he feels.
Yeah. I find that really interesting about him, that he was so so pious. I guess the words that I'm trying to come up with are evading me right now when it comes to that.
Yeah.
But maybe that has something to do with him not being as excited about the marriages that Edward IV was trying to arrange for him. Maybe some of those went against his own ideals.
To a certain extent, well, we do know that the marriage that was being kind of negotiated between him and Margaret of Scotland, they actually did get very far along the marriage negotiations. It just so happened that England went to war with Scotland, and that was the end of that. So
that put that idea to an end.
yeah.
That would have been quite amazing, though, if he had ended up being a king consort of Scotland while his sister is, queen consort of England.
Yeah, so his prospective bride was never going to be like Queen of Scotland, but even still,
Yeah.
they got so far as saying that they'd have got married in Nottingham. So I don't know whether that meant she was coming to England, but close enough.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's definitely a good point. So let's fast forward a little bit now to the point where Anthony is put in charge of his nephew, the Prince of Wales, future Edward V. How does that all come about? At what point does somebody say, this is the best person for us? Do you have any idea why he was chosen?
Yeah, so the Prince of Wales was born whilst Elizabeth was in sanctuary, whilst Edward and everybody else was away in exile. So he was kind of, I don't think in a way you can look at Edward returning without the birth of Prince Edward, because that again is obviously a symbol. People would have seen this as a sign, as a symbol saying, okay, maybe God's looking favorably on the House of York right now. And obviously that gives Edward an extra reason to come and fight back for his throne, really. But obviously, what happens obviously when Edward does obviously regain his throne, when he does come back, is that now means, oh, okay, we suddenly have a Prince of Wales to factor in now.
Yeah.
So we do know that when he's 2, it's chosen that he should go to Ludlow and kind of, have his own household by that point, people to train him up to be the future king. I mean, it doesn't happen straight off that Anthony's chosen as kind of the governor of the household. It's kind of, first of all, starts to be a little bit of a council, and then, as obviously, he's now growing out of toddler stage, it's kind of thought, right, okay, we need something more suitable. It's time for him to go on in his preparation. And we do know that actually Edward IV wrote an 11 set list of rules as to how his young son should, what his household should look like, how it should be governed. And actually Anthony Woodville is the only named person in this. So it's kind of obvious that he's kind of, once he decided that it does need to be more one person setting, out these rules, that it should be Anthony Woodville. And one of the latter rules is actually that it should be made known that people who are going to be in the household should be, pious, honest, that they shouldn't get up to things that they shouldn't. So I think a little bit is, I can remember when I first read these rules, I thought, right, so basically Edward IV wants somebody the exact opposite of him, and which is probably why Anthony was chosen, that, he's the man that's, he's also kind of the Renaissance type man that you want in charge, because it's at this point that what a future king is, should be, starting to change from just a lot more of the military side of things, that you're trying to find somebody who's a bit more cultured and, trying to be a bit more involved in the arts, in literature, and all that sort of things. And actually Anthony, ticks quite a lot of those boxes. So I think there's quite a few things going off there.
Was there anybody else who was considered other than Anthony?
This is not really, not in terms of, like I said, there was in terms of, when they have a council, and obviously there are other people involved. But when it comes to deciding who's going to be the governor, i.e. the one in charge of everything with, does always seem to be Anthony. I mean, there are other people involved, like obviously then he's going to have a priest and, lots of other people, like a chamberlain, so it works exactly the same way as any other household. But obviously, Anthony's just kind of the governor of said household.
Yeah, I like that. He's like the good uncle. He's like, yeah, the good pious uncle who is educated. He likes to read, he's a good jouster. What a good example for a future king.
Yes.
So then, sadly, in 1483, Edward IV suddenly passes away. And we have Anthony is sitting at a castle with his nephew, who is now King of England. But things don't quite turn out the way that they had expected, did they?
No. Well, first of all, that obviously means that the now Edward V is 12 years old, which causes an issue in itself, really. Boy kings do not really, it creates a power vacuum in itself, to be honest. And you think about it, even within people's living memory, you had things, Henry VI, Richard II, that didn't end well for either of them, necessarily. So, this is a worrying time. They had since Edward had returned from exile about 10 years before, they had relative peace, so there is absolute chaos and worry of, is this going to, create another eruption of the Wars of the Roses? So, as you can imagine, that means then that people are out to get what they can get. They are worried that they might lose positions that they had already. It's quite a worrying, troublesome time for everybody, really. But a lot is made of the fact that Anthony stalled, the whole household at Ludlow stalled, leaving Ludlow to get to London for the coronation. But actually, the timing of it's literally in the run up to St. George's Day. So they literally depart the day after St. George's Day. And one of the rules on Edward IV's list was that the Prince Edward should hear divine services, particularly on holy days. And how more holy can you get than the patron saint of England? So I think there's a little bit of still trying to keep that on. And obviously, Anthony himself is quite religious. And he's been instructed to bring up his nephew in religious ways. So I think it's still probably the last little bit of let's keep what we promised. So I think a lot of people read into that without necessarily realising the timeline of when that's happening necessarily. But even so, the whole point is they have agreed that they are to meet Richard, Duke of Gloucester in Northampton and then carry on to London after that. And the other issue is, obviously, with all of this chaos going off, and there has to be an armed guard, obviously, because you can't, take the king to London unaided. So there is actually negotiation at this point as to how many men is acceptable. And a number is reached of supposedly 2,000 men. And they march off towards Northampton as planned. And then this is when the story all gets a little bit murky of what happened, really. So supposedly the story goes that there was no room at Northampton for these 2,000 men, and that they go on further down the road to Stony Stratford. Now, Northampton is quite a big medieval town in terms of this time period, and Stony Stratford is basically nothing, hardly, in comparison. So it's never really made sense, that whole story necessarily. But think about it, the Northampton where they're going, Northamptonshire, this is the Woodville heartlands. This is where traditionally their land was. And Grafton Regis, their main house, actually isn't that far away from this area at all. And actually, Annette Carson, which I kind of agree with her viewpoint on this, is, well, actually, would it make sense for them, the Ludlow household, to have taken the young king to Grafton, thinking that'll be the best way to keep him safe, but not necessarily realising that that would look very suspicious to other people.
Yeah. So there's so much to this story that I feel like has been hidden from us that we don't because of what we're reading or seeing in film or on TV series, that the storyline is always one to be, Richard III is the bad guy and the Woodvilles are the good guys, right?
Yes, when actually Richard knew Anthony as well. He was within part of Edward's circle himself, obviously being Edward's brother, and they also went into exile together. And actually, just a month before Edward died, Anthony is asking Richard to intervene in a legal matter. So they're not as enemies as people necessarily think. And actually, when Anthony did stay behind in Northampton to meet Richard, as promised, alone. And I kind of go, well, if he's plotting something which is supposedly what then he's arrested for the next day, why is he meeting Richard alone? You wouldn't do that unless you utterly trusted the person that you're meeting, I don't think, and especially not at this time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I guess now we've reached the part where we have to talk about the end of Anthony Woodville and how that came to fruition.
Yeah, so as I said, the next day after Richard and Anthony meet, Anthony, as well as Richard Grey, who's one of his oldest nephews from Elizabeth Woodville's first marriage, and Thomas Vaughan, who is actually the prince's chamberlain and had been pretty much almost since birth. All three of them were arrested supposedly on a Woodville treasonous plot, and yeah, it all goes kind of downhill from there, really. So obviously the men that have all come to escort the king are all kind of sent away, saying they're part of whatever, and like I said, it's all very murky because we don't know totally what's happening at this point, but this is kind of what is thought happens. And the three men are kind of sent off to different castles owned by Richard at this point. And it's not until you get to the end of June that it's decided that they are to be executed and then sent to Pontefract Castle.
It's too bad. Honestly, what a terrible ending to the story, right?
Yes, but I think it's totally very much about the fact that actually, in many ways, I think Richard and Anthony were very similar. They had both not really been bothered about being in the political heartlands. So I think they were very much probably listening to what other people are saying about what's been going off and this, that, and the other, because in that sense, they're politically naive. They've not really been there dealing with a lot of the machinations that are happening around Edward IV. They're very much content with whatever their own lot is in life and whatever they're busy doing at that point. And I do think that the one person who changes the things a little bit is the Duke of Buckingham. As soon as he arrives, amazingly, Anthony and everybody is kind of arrested. So I think it's very much, like I said, a sense of people out for what they can get, stirring the pot, seeing if they can improve their own lot for the future.
There's so many similarities to Edward VI. I can't help but notice.
Yeah.
So anytime there's a boy king, right? There's always this
exactly
drama.
Yeah, boy king disaster.
Yeah, grasping for power. Everybody wants to be the most powerful man in the realm. Yeah, well, we've only just scratched the surface when it came to Anthony Woodville today. So if people are interested in learning more about him, where can they find your book?
Yeah, so my book is called Anthony Woodville, Sophisticate or Schemer. You can find it on Amazon and pretty much most of the good book places on the internet or whatever. And I also write a history blog called Voyager of History, and not just Anthony on that. There's all sorts of different time periods, but obviously Anthony's the main thing on there.
Yeah. Are you working on any other books at this time?
Everybody keeps asking me this, so I have the idea one, just not the title. And then I've just changed my mind entirely about what it might be. So we shall see.
Well, that's the difficult thing, isn't it? Once you write one book, everybody expects you to do more.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I would like to, and like I said, I do have some ideas for what the next one could be. It's just finding the time.
That's the key, isn't it? That is always the most important part of it, is finding the time to do the research and the writing to complete a book.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Danie, we very much looking forward to whatever work you have coming up. And in the meantime, people go check out her book. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll include some links in the show notes as well. So you can check out her website too, because she's got lots of great articles on there as well. Danie, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you again for having me.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.